So this class of ship was moved up the list by the vote of the patrons. This will be happening once per month from now on. I hope you enjoy it. So, although the first ironclad warships were not even a decade old, the arms race between guns and armour had taken off to such a degree that the wrought iron armour seen on the first generation of ironclad ships was now laughably inadequate against the latest and greatest guns, despite just over 4 inches of single-thickness good-quality plate having been near immune to incoming fire at the time those ships had been launched. Now, of course, a ship does need to retain minor details like buoyancy, so the answer wasn't simply to add more and more armour over the same length, which had been the initial and simplest idea. Instead, the citadel of the ship, which had originally been meant to be a box large enough to be completely inviolate to incoming fire and keep the ship afloat even if the rest of it was shot through, was rapidly shrinking to cover only the most vital parts of the ship. But of course, this was leaving more and more of the ship exposed, and at the same time, the increasing thickness drove guns to be larger and larger, which would need the citadel to be larger itself to fit the guns. One solution was the central battery ironclad, where the biggest guns possible were concentrated in the middle of the ship to the exclusion of almost anything else. Another solution was advocated by a Scottish shipwright, who pointed out that if you simply made the ship wider, you could fit more machinery and guns into a ship without increasing the length of the armour belt. This would also reduce a ship's draft, and through an increase in volume, more power could be installed to mitigate against the extra drag that all the extra width would cause. In theory, it would also increase the ship's agility somewhat. The calculations all seem to add up, and in general, you can see shades of this influence as capital warships went from being long, slender vessels resembling the last generation of wooden frigates to squatter and wider shapes. But in Russia, they had some unique issues, as they usually do. Russia was in the process of walking out on restrictions dating back to the Crimean War that had restricted its Baltic fleet, and so they now needed to rebuild this force. But the Baltic is also quite shallow in places, and so any new ship had to carry both the heaviest guns to make up for what would inevitably start out as relatively small numbers, but also have a very shallow draft, and at the same time as all this, would have to be very well protected. Enter Rear Admiral Andrei Alexandrovich Popov. He took the ideas of shorter and wider ships to the ultimate conclusion, and designed a ship that was completely circular. The vast surface area of the hull thus created, relative to overall size, would give the ship an incredibly shallow draft, and also ensure maximum possible width for smallest possible length, thus allowing the maximum possible armour. The requirement for heavy modern guns was especially key, as an existing monitor class of a more conventional layout met all the other requirements, and in many ways resembled the late-war Union monitors from the American Civil War, right down to carrying some 15-inch Dahlgren guns as part of the main armament. But even these massive weapons had been obsoleted by advances in naval technology, and thus a new main battery was needed. Popov suggested a number of variants on his flat-bottomed circular monitor design, and initially the largest design, armed with either 4 modern 11-inch rifled guns or 4 20-inch smoothbore weapons, and yes, I know that is something of a difference. But anyway, that design was selected. But this, on its own, would have cost more for the single ship than the entire budget that had been set aside, which was supposed to pay for 4 ships. And so the 6,000-ton, 151-foot-wide monster with almost 22 inches of armour was discarded, in favour of a smaller 96-foot-wide ship of about 2,500 tons, which was armed with a pair of 11-inch guns, the 20-inch smoothbores having been discarded. This would allow at least 2 ships to be constructed, albeit that improvements and modifications to the shipyards for vessels of this unusually large width would still push the programme over budget by quite a large amount. 2 smaller test vessels, one 11 feet wide and another 24-foot wide, the latter of which was called Kambala, which appropriately enough translates to flounder, were built first in 1871 to test the concept, and the results of these tests were reckoned successful enough to justify the main project going ahead. The first ship, the Novgorod, would thus start construction in St. Petersburg in 1871, with various parts being shipped to the Baltic by rail, barge and freighter, as they were built for final assembly on the Baltic coast, since the Baltic shipyards were not capable of building modern ironclad warships at this point. She would be launched in 1873 and welcomed into service in 1874. Because anti-fouling paint had still not been perfected, an extra layer of wood with copper sheathing was added during the build, pushing the overall diameter of the ship up to 101 feet, the wood being needed to insulate the copper from the iron to prevent a galvanic battery being formed and the ship electrolyzing itself out of existence in seawater. Much like the original USS Monitor, the 2 big guns were the ship's sole armament, with protection consisting of a belt around the entire hull, the upper 3 foot of the belt being 9 inches thick and the lower 3 foot being 7 inches thick, this latter reduction due to most of this part of the belt armour being at or below the waterline, all backed by 9 inches of teak wood. This was extremely heavy armour for a ship that weighed only as much as a relatively small corvette. The guns were positioned in an open barbette that was protected on the sides in exactly the same manner as the hull. An engine plant consisting of no less than 6 separate engines delivered 3,300 horsepower to 6 separate shafts in 2 banks of 3, plus a single central rudder for a maximum speed of just over 6 knots. The ship also shared a number of other similarities with the American Civil War ironclads. Like the USS Monitor, its rate of fire was very slow, and like CSS Virginia, its agility was not. It took almost an hour for the ship to make a full turn with her rudder, as the hull obscured almost all water flow past it. It also handled quite badly in storms, although not in danger of sinking. The non-existent bow and huge resistance from the circular hull meant that a strong storm could literally stop the ship dead in its tracks at full power, and although fairly stable, the pitching movement could easily raise the propellers out of the water. Unlike the USS Monitor, the guns could rotate on their own turntables independently of one another, but as built, the locking mechanisms on the turntables were far too weak, leaving the guns to spin happily around in randomly chosen directions whenever they were fired. This would lead to the rise of a myth that the entire ship would spin on its axis when the guns were fired. And whilst this certainly would have been quite amusing, the guns weren't quite that powerful, and being mounted in the centre had nowhere near the leverage. The steering issue was partially solved by leaving the rudder alone completely and ignoring it, and simply using the engines to steer, by which measure it was possible to achieve some quite remarkable turns, albeit at the cost of speed during the manoeuvres. This latterly discovered agility and some poor helmsmanship during one of the ship's trials combined to give rise to a myth of the ships being uncontrollable spinning tops merrily floating down the river, but this does not appear to be the case on further research, although the rate of rotation when the ship deliberately put half the engines on full ahead and the other half in reverse was apparently fast enough to make those on board dizzy. Once in service, various bits of equipment were added. The superstructure was enlarged, and a couple of 3.4-inch anti-torpedo guns were installed, partially compensated for by the removal of the outer 2 engines, once it was concluded that they actually did virtually nothing for the ship but burn more coal. The ship would receive a number of refits, first better boilers in 1883, then a couple of extra 37mm revolver cannon by 1892, at which point the Novgorod was reclassified as a coastal defence ship before being decommissioned and turned into a store ship in 1903, eventually being scrapped in 1911. But if you thought the fun ended there, oh boy would you be wrong. You'll remember the Novgorod was scaled down from the original design concept to allow funding for more ships. The second vessel was to be called Kiev, but Popov took the opportunity afforded by the debut of the ironclad HMS Devastation and its follow-ons to argue that this clearly meant his own ships needed to become even larger to counter them, and so he received permission to significantly scale up the second ship, with this second vessel now having a displacement of 3,600 tons, a slightly faster speed of 8.5 knots, and the 11-inch guns replaced by 12-inch weapons. The armour belt and barbette were thickened by adding an additional layer of 7-inch thick plate and another 9 inches of teak underneath the same armour scheme as Novgorod's, leading to a laminated armour setup of between 14 and 16 inches thickness. Additionally, 4 anti-torpedo boat guns were included from the start, in the same 3.4-inch caliber as the additions made to Novgorod. A number of design changes were also made to the hull of the ship that began to take the ship away from its monitor origins and seemed specifically to have been selected by Popov to try and iterate his designs into ocean-going warships. This included larger propellers on the inner shafts, driven by 2 engines instead of 1, more superstructure to improve seaworthiness, and an abortive attempt to rig the ship with sails. Additionally, the Russian Navy sent hull models of both ships to England, where William Froude had built the world's first hydrodynamic testing tank. But along with them came a model of a near 7,000-ton vessel, 160 foot across, with a design speed of 14 knots, a clear attempt to work out if this would be a useful next step. The main guns were also supposed to use British-built mountings, allowing them to pop up above the barbette ring, fire, and then disappear down into the protected area. Whilst these would eventually be delivered, after a flare-up of tension between Britain and Russia for other reasons, the ship spent its first 2 years with mountings similar to those on Novgorod, and which again proved to be too weak. Also, unlike Novgorod, the ship would be built in newly refurbished shipyards on the Baltic coast. Originally started in 1872, the pause for redesign meant that the ship would be restarted again in 1874, renamed after her designer to Vice-Admiral Popov, and launched in 1875, entering service the next year. Her hull was also very slightly oblong as compared to Novgorod's completely circular layout. Like her half-sister, she would eventually lose the outermost engines and gain a couple of revolver cannon. Although both ships were present in the Baltic during the Russo-Turkish War of the late 1870s, they were assigned to defence duties only and thus did not see action. Like her sister, she would be taken out of service in 1903 and scrapped in 1911. There would be one final attempt by Popov to convince the world of his circular ship ideas, the yacht Livadia. But that's a story for another time.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.